Leo Tolstoy once said in Essays, Letters, and Miscellaneous, "If then I were asked for the most important advice I could give, that which I considered to be the most useful to the men of our century, I should simply say, in the name of God, stop a moment, cease your work, and look around you." This is the Producers Lounge podcast, the best podcast online for tips and tricks on producing great film, television, and web content. Welcome back for Season 3, Episode 7, hosted and produced by greaterandgrander.com. On this week's episode, we're chatting with Rachid El Guerrab, who has produced video games, Emmy Award-winning shorts, Oscar-nominated shorts, and even experimental VR games for Google, including Pearl as well as Rain or Shine. He's also worked on games such as The Simpsons, Daxter the video game, and God of War. We discuss navigating the tightrope between tech and entertainment storytelling, and how to create compelling stories for new mediums like VR and 360 video. Growing up in Morocco, Rachid has traveled the world working for some of the biggest companies on the globe, and now he brings this insight to you. Here now is my conversation with Rachid El Guerrab. Well, I know that's one of the ongoing feuds, right, between the Bay Area and LA, is LA steals all of the Bay Area's water, right?
I guess because, they keep watering the desert.
So what have you been up to lately?
I've left Google a few years ago. We started a small startup, really around crazy ideas, things that we couldn't do when we were working at Google. We did some VR projects and VR animation, short films and whatnot, and also kind of a passion project. So
Okay.
it's been it's been just mostly things I don't know how to do. Some of the things I know how to do. Although this is not my first startup, but it's very different in how we went about it. So it's been fun.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to touch on in this interview with you because, talking about, obviously you spent some time on the engineering side, but also on the producing side. And what I think people don't really understand is like being a producer is really like being a serial entrepreneur because you're just going from project to project.
Yeah. I mean, there's not much different really from, a CEO to a producer.
Mhm.
In a lot of ways, actually, because especially in smaller productions where you,
Mhm.
as a producer, have to do a lot more than, let's say, if you're working for a big studio and people, handling marketing for you and PR and so many other things. We did everything ourselves. And so you get to not only participate, which is nice, but you actually get to make decisions, which is the scary part.
Mhm.
And I always thought, like, I worked in games where producers are not the same function. They're more like help manage things.
Mhm.
Obviously, in film, at least,
Mhm.
producer is more or less like the COO/CEO of the operation.
Yeah.
I mean, they actually make the decisions, they make the calls, they fire people, they do all the produce. At least in most of my experience in games, producers were never like the guy you go to if you really want something fixed. They're more like the guy that helps making things run and check on status and make sure that stuff is happening.
Mm.
And that's very different from film, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Let's start at the beginning. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Morocco,
Mhm.
um, mostly in a city called Marrakesh
Mhm.
since I was 5. And then later on, went into engineering
Mhm.
because you had to find something to make money, and went into computer science because I couldn't make it into other things that I really wanted, which turned out to be a much better, actually, choice. And then
Can I ask what was the alternate path that you didn't pursue?
I was fascinated by more the sort of electrical engineering, electronics,
Mm.
lots of more physics-based domains than computer science or programming.
Mhm.
And like, probably a lot of young people even listening to this, back then, it wasn't like I had a computer at home that I could play with or whatnot. I only had, I think, access to a computer in the lab in high school for like an hour a week. So it wasn't something that was like you can kind of create a passion about if you really don't play with it.
Mm.
But I wanted to go into electrical engineering. I wanted to go into other more physical based sort of domains, but I wasn't. My levels of physics were not as good as my levels in math and other things, and so
Mm.
um, you apply to schools and to get what you get. But it was right as like Windows 95 was coming out, and it was right
Mhm.
as there was internet was becoming something, and so right away I felt like, okay, this might not be a bad idea.
Okay.
And the same way, after I graduated, I was a sort of a serious software engineer looking for careers in, I don't know, finance or make database software or make operating systems or something serious.
Mhm.
And I remember going around looking for an internship. And,
Mhm.
most we just didn't fit for most interviews and so on, me and a friend of mine. And then we just by chance one day around lunchtime saw this sign for a small company called Ubisoft in Paris.
Mhm.
We thought, hey, maybe, yeah, let's see. We heard that they may have some internships. Let's just put our resume there. We went in, we talked to this wonderful guy who's still my friend now, who was leading some engineering work. And he just fascinated us with like how complicated games were back then.
Uh,
Because we had thought, it's like some people in a garage having fun with processors and so on to make some pixels move.
mhm.
But no, it was really fascinating. We decided to do it, and even for a year after that, and then after the internship, I ended up getting a job there.
Mhm.
And even a year into it, I was still waiting for the moment where I'm going to leave that and go do something serious.
Ah.
And then I ended up in a conference called SIGGRAPH, which is a big graphics conference in LA. At the time, it was in LA.
Now, real quick,
Yeah.
walk us through the timeline. You studied in Marrakesh or in Paris?
I studied in Marrakesh, Rabat, which is another big university there, then a bit in Paris, then
Mhm.
worked with Ubisoft in Paris, then back to Casablanca, where Ubisoft had
Mhm.
opened a studio and helped like kind of run the first teams of engineers there. And I was very young too, so it was kind of this is around 98, 99.
Mhm. Mhm.
And 99, I was trying to see if I can now apply for some serious jobs, maybe with Oracle or something like that, or
Mhm.
IBM, and then I got the chance to come to the US for SIGGRAPH 99.
Mhm.
And it was about graphics, and we had a big team from Ubisoft. And I was fascinated because I've never really seen that much of that domain.
Mhm.
Everything from animation. Pixar was showing a lot of shorts. I think at the time it was potentially Jerry's Game, which kind of comes back in my life later.
Mhm.
Subdivision surfaces, all kinds of interesting things. And I was just fascinated. And I thought, okay, this is it. This is my domain. I'm going to do this the rest of my life. This is way too much fun. And yeah, so about a year and a half later, I left Ubisoft to get my first job in the US
Mhm.
with a company called Midway, which
Mhm.
was a big gaming company a while back. I don't think it's that big now. Um, and then went from game company to game company, usually like a few years each. Last one was this company called Ready at Dawn,
Mhm.
and did something like a God of War and Jack and Daxter sort of um, series on PlayStation Portable. I worked on consoles. I was from the lowest level of engineering in terms of what you do, all the way to graphics, AI, physics, all sorts of stuff. And
Mhm.
games are interesting for a technologist because they embody so many domains and so many interesting fields.
Mhm.
Um, then from I finished exactly 10 years in game to the day in video games, and I thought, okay, that's it for me because it was just becoming a little bit too repetitive, not that interesting anymore. I wanted
Mhm.
to see what's out there.
Mhm.
Wanted to start a startup with a friend of mine. He was working for Qualcomm. Let me know if I'm going too fast or anything. I'm just turning
No,
around.
it's this is all helpful, and I think just to add some context, I think it's interesting that you mentioned like the dynamic aspect of games because I looked into games a few years ago, um, not from a like producing standpoint, but more kind of just an indie game kind of creation standpoint.
Yeah.
And I was hoping like, oh, maybe there's just a rules engine or a physics engine I could just grab and then copy paste in the artwork, right? But no, it's you got to basically rebuild the physics engine every game. It's pretty dynamic.
Yeah, and especially at the time. I mean, right now there's some sort of stability, which I kind of consider fake stability, with some engines like Unreal and Unity that are becoming like the
Mm,
big giant ones.
mhm,
But I still think like some of the major issues and things we were dealing with like 20 years ago are still a problem today. And partly is
ah,
that games are not just tech,
mhm,
and they're not precise tech. They're made for entertainment,
mhm,
which in but also they're like, if film is sort of, there's a certain language to film. Of course, there's genres and so on, but
mhm,
there's a certain language to it. You kind of can see what the structure is, no matter what film you're watching. Games are like, hundreds of different structures, thousands of different sort of offshoots that can be widely different,
mhm,
both in terms of audience, in terms of making, in terms of what they're trying to do. So it's that openness makes it, a complex, obviously, world, and obviously now it's a huge world, even in terms of, you know how much money is in it and so
mhm,
on. So yeah, I mean, I was mostly interested in story-based games.
mhm,
And in the beginning, I did well, I worked on whatever I could find, of course. So there was some simulation, some racing games, some stuff like that. But once I worked on Daxter, which was our first out of this small team called Really Done at the time, and
mhm,
then God of War,
mhm,
those are, of course, adventure games that are very much story-based,
mm,
and the story is very important and so on. And even as a programmer, I loved all the conversations. I kind of participated a little bit in some character design, some other things like that. But I loved the conversation around the stories and what does it mean and so on. Unfortunately, most games can't push that much further because it's too complex, and most people play games at like 20% or whatever. So nobody gets to the end, or very
mhm.
few people. I remember a comedian making a joke that games are the only medium that can stop you from continuing if you're not good enough. Like, imagine a book that tells you, okay, you finished chapter 2. Here's some questions. Can you answer? If you don't, nope, you can't read.
Yeah.
Done. So it's interesting. And so, but I really wanted to push more in that field, but I thought games were becoming repetitive at the time. It's what they call AAA games.
Mhm,
It was just not becoming that interesting. So I left. I joined my friend at Qualcomm for a brief period because mobile was happening,
mm,
and mobile graphics were happening, and games would come into that.
mhm,
And also just like the fact that on your phone now, at even 2008, we're talking, you had the power to be able to do lots of cool stuff, cool looking stuff. Finally, it wasn't just a little functional sort of device.
mhm,
And and then we started our startup from that, because we had figured that, um, although graphics are great and so on, the everybody that was working on phones was from the old school.
mhm.
And there's a huge field of artists and visual designers and visual effects people and so on that can bring so much to how it looks and how it plays and what it displays and so on, that weren't getting really access to that technology because it was too complicated and so on. So we decided to work on tools.
And this is human engines when you
This is
started.
Human Engines.
Okay.
Yes, it was started like the end of 2008.
Mhm,
And through that, we worked with Qualcomm actually on some tools projects. We worked with so many different companies: Google, Barnes and Noble, etc.,
mhm,
and Lenovo, all the way to Motorola.
mhm,
And we had some experience we were working with them on, and we were looking for investment, and they proposed to acquire the company because they thought we would be a good fit for user experience, because
mhm,
that was kind of our domain. We kind of brought that from games. It's this meetup of artists, visual designers, and coders.
mhm,
And we joined Motorola around end of 2011, which also was being bought at the same time by Google.
mhm,
And that's how we ended up at Google.
mhm,
Google spent a year or so doing not much because that's how startup acquisition works. Most of it especially in this side
Mhm.
of Silicon Valley. You acquire people and then you figure out, oh, what do I do with them? I don't know, but we acquired them.
Got
So,
so so if I may ask then,
yeah.
that process from Human Engines, the end of 2008, to then Motorola in 2011, and then to Google in what I think is 2014. Um,
Yeah, it was officially Google 2014, but 2011 Motorola that we were part of was already part of Google.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, because Google was acquiring them at the same time.
So what did you learn that was the most important for you during that overall process?
That phase and that I learned, I mean, the startup experience itself was obviously, especially the first one, was
Mhm.
you know, crazy. It was, we're learning on the job, trying
Mhm.
things. Um, Difficult. You're responsible for people's salaries now and people's livings, and you have to make plans. And it was very stressful. It
Mhm.
was We worked on like 20 some projects, I think, in a period of 2.5 years.
Mhm.
So it was, a lot of obviously shooting in the dark. It
Mhm.
was sort of, even though we did our own technology and so on, it was still kind of a service startup because we worked with big companies that wanted to ship some product on their phone or wanted to show off something that they're doing or whatnot.
Mhm.
And I realized at that point that I was not good for the business universe
Mhm.
where I'm making software for businesses. I'm making this whole B2B thing. It was just, it was so much more um like I understood it better because I understood that when you're selling your thing, whether it's your service or your technology to another big business,
Mhm. Mhm.
it's not about logic and it's not about like, okay, how much money they make if they get your thing or any of that. It's about
Mhm.
humans.
Mhm.
It's about who is going to profit from who, what's the political thing, and all of that. Just, I was like, okay, I understand how to do it. We were successful in doing it and, getting through it,
Mhm.
presentations to people and all that stuff. But it was not the thing that I wanted to live doing. It wasn't really like what I want to do. And at Google, um, with Motorola as well, the thought was, okay, now we're in the middle, we're in the center. These guys make phones and they make them
Mhm.
for people.
Mhm.
So now again, I'm back to what I was with games, which is making things directly for people, which
Mhm.
is what I always felt was the best position. Um, this happened also with Spotlight Stories, which is the other project later on.
Mhm.
Like I realized really that um, when you're in a big company or even a startup or dealing with investors or so on, there's so much conversations about this would work, this wouldn't work, this is going to fail, and so on and so forth. And then
Mhm.
you ship it, and people take it over,
Mhm.
and then all those conversations disappear.
Mhm.
Then it just becomes, was the thing good or not good? And this is why it's so difficult to, selling to businesses. It's just so much politics in it. But
Right.
when you make something good, you might fail because it wasn't good and you learn from it. If
Mhm.
you're selling something to, 10,000, 100,000, millions of people, if it's good, it's going to do well. And you
Mhm.
won't have to prove yourself to anybody specifically. That's it. The work just proves itself. And that's such a good feeling. That's how it was for games. Like you crunch and you crunch and you crunch, then you put your game out. And if people love it, you're good. You're set.
Mhm. Got it. So that's so that is quite the whirlwind journey then from
It was. And at Google, as I said, like for a bit, we were doing all sorts of things, helping with figuring out how to do user experience and so on. But it's a big company, Motorola itself, and we had some relationships with Google. And we weren't really getting through until Google hired this lady named Regina Dugan, who created this entity called Advanced Technologies and Projects, which was modeled almost like a DARPA program.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be this sort of researchy a bit, but mostly product development that is between Motorola and Google. Motorola being a mobile company, Google being sort of like the big, obviously, internet company.
Mhm.
And at the same time, it's between research a little bit, but also looking into things that will happen 5 years from now.
Mm.
And I remember the first meetings with Regina about like, what do we do? We showed some cool graphics. What can we do with the powers of the phone and so on?
Mhm.
And she asked us, can you do something emotional that will connect people
Mhm.
to the device? That was the sort of the challenge. And few years of or few months of prototyping and trying things, and of course we know games, so we start there. But then it's not really what we're looking for. And then we connect with people from film. That's where we connected with Jan Tinkava, who was our
Mhm.
creative director later on, and he was the guy who directed Jerry's Game, which I was talking about as the first shorts that I was really enamored with. And he also, I think, he created and co-directed Ratatouille at Pixar. We
Mhm.
kind of hired him sort of for a writing job
Mhm.
on the thing that we were trying to create, and then
Just
sparked.
just to make sure I understand that you're hiring him to write something, but this is not for a game necessarily. This is a emotional app,
It
something.
was sort of. It was like, because it's what happens in these researchy kind of groups is you're going all over the place. You don't really know where you're going to begin with.
Mhm.
So we kind of came up with an idea for sort of a game that
Mhm.
was living in your phone. There was like, the idea was there are these characters that are behind the screen of your phone that are running your phone.
Huh.
These are the people that work behind the scene to make sure it runs.
The little gremlins in the phone.
Exactly. And because we were good at tech, we could make, and because we had access to the phone and its software, we could make it so that you just swipe from your front screen and all that UI will just unfold and show what's happening behind.
Mhm.
And we designed it first as a game.
Mhm.
And then we needed like to give it character and whatnot, because again, we wanted something that's more gripping to people.
Right.
And that's where we connected with a writer from film, because we thought he'll give us some good background story, good characters, and then those would be kind of the main ingredients in the game.
Mhm.
But then as we started talking and figuring out how do we even navigate in this world behind the phone without any UIs or anything,
Mhm.
um, we sort of it just through conversations really hit this idea of what if the camera on the phone, since it has the what's called the viewfinder, which is the thing that you see where you're going to take a picture of,
Mhm.
but if through that you see the
Oh.
the virtual world,
Mm.
through that camera you see the virtual world of the story instead of seeing like your normal thing that you're filming.
Mhm.
And so it was an interesting way. Again, this is 2012 almost.
Mhm.
Before VR had a rebirth, before 360 videos,
Mhm.
we were just trying to find what's a good way to navigate with the phone. And we thought, hey, if you can, like the moment you hold your phone, now you start seeing stuff behind that's like, oh, that's the world behind my phone.
Mhm.
And then from there, conversations happened about how do you tell even the little cutscene, the story to begin the game. And then conversations about like, how do you tell a story? And of course, we were having it with a filmmaker.
Mhm. Mhm.
How do you tell a story where the viewer holds the camera,
Mhm.
like even conceptually,
Right.
right? Because you're not now in control of the camera.
Mhm.
And then that landed to us doing some little prototyping and so on. And then we started getting more artists, and we had a team put together, some of the ex artists from Pixar, some people from DreamWorks, and we set up a little team. And the idea was, you know what, maybe instead of focusing on the game and whatnot, we started looking very much not interesting.
Mhm.
Um, let's make a short film, but you still navigate it with that mechanism. Kind of called it a virtual window.
Mhm.
And that's how me getting into film started. Because for the first time, we had a film team. They went through
Mhm.
the film process, with art director, storyboards, the notes, director notes, all of the environment, sitting in the same table, sometimes in the same desks, with programmers and game designers and gameplay programmers who are trying to implement how do we navigate in this world with the camera.
Mhm.
And first one we did was called Windy Day, directed by Jan Pikava.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, again, it was explaining this whole idea of, doubts. Almost, I would say almost 80% of the people or 90% of the people that saw it outside of our team
Mm-hmm.
were like, this is gimmicky. Who cares? What is this? It's not a game. It's not a film. It's a weird thing. And once it got out to people, they got so much praise and so much interest that we're like, okay, we got something here. This was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of the beginning of the adventure called Google Spotlight Stories, which was like almost a 7-year deal. It was supposed to be a 2-year project. It became a 7-year project
Mm-hmm.
with, at least I think we shipped maybe 20, maybe 18, 20 short films, almost each one of them with a different director,
Mm-hmm.
different studios sometimes, that
It was
did various things.
It was promoted at Comic-Con, right?
It was promoted at Comic-Con. It was all over the place.
Yeah.
We got an Emmy later on for Pearl, which was another short film, which was also nominated for an Oscar. I mean, it exploded. But in the beginning, it was this like weird thing. And we would go to events like film
Mm-hmm.
or tech, and we wouldn't know where to sit because it wasn't really tech,
Mm-hmm.
like, but it wasn't also film.
Mm-hmm.
And you couldn't see it, like we couldn't send a link to people and say, here, watch this film, here's what we did. No, you had to get the phone, especially at the time it was exclusive to Motorola, the first one. So you had to get the phone. We literally sent phones to critics. And I remember even like the first time we applied for an Emmy, which was a short, like maybe it was our 4th or 5th project,
Mm-hmm.
we did the same thing. We sent phones to the jury because that's the only way they can really experience it.
Right.
It is an interactive film
Mhm.
that you had to watch while holding the phone and following the story.
Mhm.
Um, and then, of course, it just happened that what we were doing was fitting so well with the VR kind of hype that was mounting. So we started putting the same things on like big VR headsets and so on. And then it kind of just went from there.
Wow. So it really was pushing like a whole and would you say from that like came kind of the VR AR growth?
Well, I
That-
think I think there were a few things happening. I think there was a lot of push on the tech side from different companies. Obviously, Facebook with their big purchase of Oculus
Mhm.
of VR,
Right.
but and then there was some push in 360 videos early on by GoPro and other companies like that.
Mhm.
And we happened to hit on this filmmaking in VR, which was very rare. There was like one other studio called Oculus Story Studio,
Mhm.
which kind of opened after. So we had, in my opinion, and even talking to people that had pioneered sort of filmmaking for VR,
Mhm.
especially in the animation side, there was a lot of, let's call it, I don't know if it's inspiration, or at least they could see some of the stuff that we did, and we did obviously presentations and wrote about it and so on, and
Mhm.
kind of h- helped pave the way for others who were trying to figure out, how do I do this? I
Mhm.
want to do like this kind of immersive story or immersive film. How do I do it?
Mhm.
And so we kind of, yeah, I think in the story parts of it, in the film, immersive film parts of it, I think we were definitely pioneers.
That brings me to my next question, which is, you're at the forefront of the VR AR storytelling revolution. As you're going through this, where do you see what are the keys to making a successful VR or AR story? Because it is very much immersive. You can't control what the viewer does or doesn't do or what they can or cannot look at. So what are the keys to making something successful in that arena?
um, I mean, to be, in my opinion,
Mhm.
to be successful in making something that's immersive,
Mhm.
which is a new medium, I think, especially for film. I mean, a lot of people in games might think it's, we've done this before, which is not
Mhm.
actually true.
Mhm.
I think the first condition is to realize that it is a new medium. and that things are this like you're not designing only or creating only um sort of a story that you can control and you can time exactly and you can lay out as you want. You are creating an experience,
Mhm.
and it's there's so much more to the thinking about what is the experience of that viewer in the middle of that world that you're giving them. um and like with the thing that we're now familiar with, which we weren't familiar with 100 years ago, which is okay, the theater format, the film format, which was also at the time was kind of strange as well. And I think the I don't know if it's as much of a jump as between, let's say, radio or novels to cinema, but it is a real jump. Thank God it's not like 3D, which came and went. I don't think anybody cares anymore about 3D films. Um, and then once there's that realization that, and we always started with one question. We when we talked to directors, whether people that wanted to work with us or people that we approached,
Mhm.
a lot of times we sort of looked for people who are first skeptical,
Mhm.
not people who are super excited because they just see the good stuff. They don't see the all the like the difficulty of it.
Interesting.
And we talked to people who really sort of we tried to find people that were really care about their craft
Mhm.
because through the years of working with some amazing directors, from Justin Lin to Patrick Osborne to Glenn Keane to, I mean, these are like great names.
Mhm.
Uh, whatever, whatever you, whatever they understand of their crafts in terms of storytelling or in terms of filmmaking or animation is going to be challenged
Mhm.
to the end level when you're in VR, and you want to do it right. And that's the important thing because, like, unfortunately, because of the difficulty in tech and complexity and so on, 90% of the projects were sort of like, here's something cool that we put in VR, and VR is cool by definition. Therefore, this should, be good. But it's never like that. It's actually worse.
Mhm.
Something could be almost okay if you're just watching a film, and when you put it in VR, it gets way worse if it's not well done.
Alright.
And so it's you get challenged. So whether the guys from Pixar were challenged in their animation, literally in the art form, Glenn Keane was challenged in his hand drawn animation because he had to rethink things. There's a making of on the Spotlight Stories channel where he explains how, like, one tree, he had to draw a tree that two characters go up to, which would take you like, maybe like few days for him to do the animation, became such a challenge to do that one scene in VR and do it right. And that's the important thing, is wanting to do it right.
Mhm.
Just to Lynn, I remember the first time when, and of course, when you just Lynn from his fast action movies and Fast and Furious and so on.
Yep.
So actually, I was surprised that he was excited when we showed him a little Windy Day animation. That's kind of sort of also the making of a true artist, is that we showed him a little like mouse right after a hat, and he's a big giant Hollywood budget filmmaker,
Mhm.
and that got him excited, and he talked and talked and was so like into it, and was trying to figure out how to do something with it in his domain.
Mhm.
And I remember the first test shoot, we did a little test. We had to build our own 360 cameras at the time to
Mhm.
be at the quality that somebody like Justin wants to see. And we did the shoots in LA actually. And the scene was supposed to be this girl running down a tunnel and then running away from something. And then she looks right at the end of the tunnel. She looks up and she sees this big monster, with like helicopters around him and whatnot. This kind of Godzilla like creature. That
Mhm.
was it. And it was like in the script, it was 10 to 15 seconds. We budgeted for that, everything. And of course, these budgets at his level are ginormous.
Mhm.
But then as we started actually filming it and so on, he started to realize this is not a 15-second or 10-second. This is at least 45 to 50-second shots. And
Mhm.
the reason is you can't just rely anymore on like, okay, people are just following the girl, and then right as she looks up or right as she gets out of the thing, they see the monster. They're not going to necessarily know that there's a monster
Mhm.
if they hear it. They're not looking the same, in the same sort of fashion as your camera cuts will make them do. You can't control the time the same way. So he had to allow for the time that takes people to realize, oh, there's something there. Oh, I see a helicopter over here. And it's physical for people when they're immersed. It's not the same as looking at, a screen in front of them.
Right.
It's a physical movement, right?
Mhm.
And even for acting, which kind of we had realized with animation as well, the the actor has to almost play it up better and more
Mhm.
clearer. Like she has to look up and
Mhm.
it's clear to people that she's guiding their eye towards the thing. Of course, added to it, sound effects and lighting and so on that help sort of get the attention of people. It's like theater. It's less like film necessarily,
Mhm.
at least in the aspects of controlling the camera, of course. And so I think most of the challenge for directors that we worked with, which has some of them huge experience in film before,
Mhm.
was this realization that this is I'm not just designing a thing on a frame. I'm designing an experience which is very physical. Like people have to look up or look down. I want them to do this. I want them to do that without ever telling them specifically what. In fact, I remember in Simpsons, which was a very short project we did with the Simpsons team.
Uh-huh.
Um, the Albert Brooks, who was obviously the head of the whole thing and quite a character, was super involved in the project. And at the
Mhm.
end, I remember there was a moment in it where he literally added the bit of sound where Homer would say, "Look up," or something like, "Look up, you dummy," or something like
Uh-huh.
that,
Uh-huh.
just in case. Because of course, when you do an interactive film where people are allowed to look around and take time and whatnot, you have to create scenarios and fallbacks and things for all the other things that might happen.
Mhm.
You're not just dealing with your story, you're dealing with all the eventualities of what would people do. And again, if you're just going to do a linear story with like, here is exactly how I want it to happen, why is it immersive? Why is it in VR? It may not need to be. And it's so I think we used to have these like this thing we call the 7 stages that a director will go through as they work in VR. And it starts with like, this is interesting. I don't know if it's for me. Then, oh, this is actually very interesting. I'm intrigued. I'm amazed. The tech is cool. Look at me. I'm inside my environment. This is awesome. Then
Mhm.
it goes to, okay, I'm going to go back to doing my thing that I know, which is here's how the story is going to flow. And then we tell them, well, that doesn't really work. And then we try to work on one small scene and it takes them so much longer than they're used to, and they're frustrated and they have headaches and they can't sleep. And then they realize, okay, like, don't worry about it. We'll work this out. Here's all the stuff we can do in the tech. Here's all the stuff we can do in sort of in the animation or in the filming to get something that's actually really interesting. And by the end, we're always thinking this is the time where they're going to say, okay, thank you guys. This was whatever. I'm never going to work on something like this before. But it always ended with, when do we do the next one?
Oh, nice.
And that was obviously a great moment.
You have any funny stories about working with Brooks on The Simpsons? I gotta.
Well, but I remember like the first time a friend of mine who's actually my partner now
Mhm.
showed him Pearl. Pearl was the story by Patrick Osborne, who was nominated for an Oscar
Mhm.
and won an Emmy. And it was this like really emotional story of a father and daughter in a car,
Mhm.
kind of going through various cities, but going through life as well. They grow through it, and it's a song as well as a sort of a road trip.
Mhm.
But it was our to a large extent our sort of like the peak that we got to after so much like
Mhm.
trials and fighting and so on. It was just a after that, like Spotlight Stories became like the big, you know, known projects everywhere. And it was a very emotional story. And it's the first one we did for full VR, what we call full VR, meaning that you have the headset and you can move and
Mhm.
do whatever. And it was the go-to that we always used if we wanted to impress someone about what VR really is.
Mm.
So, like for a lot of these characters or these sort of like you know legendary people like Mel Brooks, um, they hear VR and they see stuff and they're like, I don't know that. What is that? That's just like it's not for me.
Mhm.
Um, and we always say, okay, just find can we find someone that knows someone that we could set up a demo and we
Mhm.
just play this one thing for them, which was Pearl at the time. I mean, afterwards we had others, but if we just play this one and see how they feel about VR afterwards. And
Mhm.
I think the moment we thought we got it was my friend. They went to I think they were to their studio, or there was maybe a Google office that they all got to,
Mhm.
and they got him to see Pearl. And right after he finished it, it's like a 4.5, 5 minute short. Right after he finished it, and these headsets are big, especially back then, and uncomfortable, and you get sweaty and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Right after he finished it, he said, "Can I do it again?"
Ah.
And now you got him. Now he's interested. But and then that's of course that's one phase, and then started working with their fantastic team, who I've never seen like a more because the whole project was a Simpsons story was like 3.5 minute short, and it was like a couch gag that we did in 360,
Mhm.
and um so it was like a really like the fastest project we've ever done. It took maybe like from the moment we had the first call to the moment it was done, maybe 40 days.
Mm.
It was
Mm.
so fast,
Mhm.
but it was so good watching their process and how they quickly come up with like ideas in the writer room, and sort of by the end of the day they're already on the animation getting done, and there's like a tight ship. Was so good. But of course, when you come to 360, it's a lot harder. So
Yeah.
you would get the script. So I still have that. I use it sometimes in my presentation where it says like, okay, and then here we look up and we see this. We're like, no, you can't write that. You
Mhm.
can't do that. They can't just look up. You gotta give them some reason, and then give me something else that would happen if they don't look up
Mhm.
at least. And it was back and forth, back and forth. And I remember, as I said, the last one was when he would add things like silly things like that, like
Look up, dumb dumb. Yeah.
look up dummy, or you know, uh, there's a part in the beginning that says like, is it VR yet? Is it VR yet, or something like that? Because we're actually waiting for the viewer, in this case, to move their phone to realize that they can look around.
Mhm.
So it's always interesting when there are technical problems that get fixed in the story, and it makes it for such a cool sort of like new thing. And like a lot of people obviously are, especially in film, are used to the we can fix it in post, like the
Mhm.
tech will. We actually do the reverse a lot of times.
Mhm.
In the tech, you get something that just you cannot handle, and you need to change the story to make it fit and to make it work. So yeah, we had a lot of fun with those guys. Fastest project, the most exhilarating.
I think it's also fascinating that you are coming in, this experience behind you, the short that's nominated for an Oscar, the full backing of Google, and you're still trying to get who do we know that knows a guy who knows a
Of
guy?
course.
Like it's like okay, I need the stars, assistants, yoga instructor, like
Yes, yes. Yeah, and like there were a lot of projects that we didn't ship, and some of
Mhm.
them were with some big names actually.
Oh.
And interestingly, some of the projects, at least,
Mhm.
that happened through the idea that this is Google and we just want to kind of do something cool with Google and so on, actually the ones that failed.
Really?
And some of the ones that came through this sort of like creative community itself, these like people who know, like the first when we did the first Windy Day, which was said Jan Pinkovas, it was Jan and another animator, Doug Sweetland, we was like famous for Toy Story and so on, who worked on Windy Day. Doug Sweetland, I think, it was the guy who connects this to Glen Keane,
Mhm.
and that's how we, they know how to, who to talk to, who be interested in, how to present the thing to them in such a way that it's tickles their brain. And like a lot of people that came in because this is again Google, it's interesting, or there's a lot of money. Of course, we produced, some shorts were expensive.
Mhm.
Um, actually end up being just fluff and not as interesting creatively, or as people involved with them because they think this is actually really neat. And so yeah, I mean, we are grateful to all the, mostly the team, the X teams that
Mhm.
worked on other spotlight stories that kind of got it spread around to other creators, and we ended up working with some amazing people.
Okay. I want to ask you one more Google
Yeah.
question, which is like you mentioned the project with Justin Lin
Mhm.
and you budgeted it as a 15-second shot and then you need to add more to it.
Yeah.
How do you go and like how do you specifically go to Google and say, look, and like how do you make the pitch? We need this much extra money, but we know it's going to be worth it because of X, Y, Z.
Yeah, that was a lot of a lot of pain. Um, well, the way the whole project was structured,
Mhm.
at the end of the day, was an R&D project.
Mhm.
Um, and of course, doesn't mean it's open, open check or anything, but there's, you know, the, to make it in Google
Mhm.
in general, especially if you're talking about an artistic project in a sense,
Mhm.
uh, nobody's going to care. And I don't mean by that Google doesn't care about art or anything like that. But Google is a tech company, it's a platform company, it's an internet company.
Right.
You have to present things in a way that matter to that sort of essence of what Google is, which is a technology company.
Mhm.
So the project is from a Google perspective, is a technology project.
Mhm.
But generally, our positioning was that, like Pixar in a sense,
Mhm.
with RenderMan, for example, which is their rendering software, um, RenderMan wouldn't be that great without the fantastic stories and films that were made with it through Pixar and later on through others. And our point of view was that this is, as we usually repeat this phrase, which I think is attributed to John Lasseter. It's, you know, art challenges technology, technology inspires art. The idea is that we're my position and my presentations to Google executives and so on is that it's through doing great films with great people that know how to do their craft that we will make great technology that everybody would want to have. And then it becomes a question of like, okay, here is what we budget. Here's how much flexibility we have. Here's other things. Here's other partners we could grab. Like we did a music video, for example, with the Gorillas, which is a famous rock band,
Yeah.
English rock band. That was like in partnership with YouTube, and we did like other stuff. So we kind of gather partners around Google. Some of them are interested in it because of marketing. Some of them are interested in it because the thing we did with Justin Lin ended up being used by YouTube to push their 360 video for a long time after,
Mm.
and 360 audio after that, and they, because it was like the best for years, almost like 3-4 years still after we shipped it. It was still the best example of 360 content
Wow.
because it was done with high quality cameras, high quality audio, good music. It was a good production, and that cannot be replaceable. Like you can do as many demos as you want, but you can't excite people if it's not really good. And so, yeah, and then there's just lots of convincing and presentations and so on to tell people this is this is important, it's interesting, and we think this is the way it should be done.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. And then came the time for you to leave Google. Um,
Yes.
you left around 2018, and after that, you created Stealth Startup.
Yes. Um, yeah, one of the things that I wanted to do was
Mhm,
already at Google
mhm,
was push more towards the storytelling side of the projects.
mhm,
These projects with VR and 360 were highly technical.
mhm,
Even though we did some great shorts and very successful and so on,
mhm,
there was so much complexity
mhm,
that, and I felt like there was so much more potential in the storytelling part of it,
mhm,
but it was so complex that we could barely finish sort of like a first version almost of what we wanted to do. And I also realized personally, and this was kind of my aha moment, is every one of these tech companies has a core value or a core um, philosophy that defines them. And
mhm,
if you are working sort of not in that core part of their inner soul,
mhm,
you are always fighting. And Spotlight Stories was a lot of fighting to get,
mhm,
not only budgets, but to get like integrated into YouTube, to get some tech partnership, to get PR, to get marketed. I mean, we had to go to our own app because we couldn't. Our hope was to actually, it just being part of YouTube, like officially, or part of Google Play or other things like that, because those are much bigger products than us. But it was, very hard to begin with. We ended up shipping it inside of YouTube, but it didn't get the marketing at once. It's just all this like things that we had to do just to have our own existence. And we ended up with our own app, which ended up being actually a good thing for us because we could do whatever we want with it to some level, and we were in control.
mhm,
And so after 5 years at least of mostly fighting to just get the minimum things done,
mhm,
and it just looked like this is not the place to do even more things that are potentially more artistic than technology when we're talking about storytelling.
mhm,
And um and so, yeah, so it was like I really feel like there's something here that's interesting to explore, and there's all this complexity that I would like to reduce. I want these projects to become a creative endeavor
mhm,
as much as film is, even though there's a lot of tech and VFX and so on and so forth. But film is still a very creative endeavor, at a big level. You don't necessarily have to have the VFX to do a kind of fantastic story. You don't have to have the tech.
mhm,
And it was just too complex. So I thought, hey, let's rethink. It was a good time. We took some time off, went to some, story classes, and uh, kind of dug deeper into film and how things are made. Met with hundreds of people around the world that we had worked with somewhat, but I wanted to learn more about sort of how to think about this field and where it's going and so on. And then we kind of come together to some understanding of, okay, here's a path that will get us to this moving away from um, just a complex tech thing that can only exist in some big tech company funding it,
mhm.
to something that's actually amenable to normal people. To a writer can sit down and write something potentially interactive and immersive. Um, a small team can put together like at least a prototype, a previs that is viewable in whether it's VR or interactive TV or AR or whatnot. And that was such a like an exciting concept
Mhm.
for us that we said, okay, let's do this.
Okay, so let's say I'm a filmmaker.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm interested in this. How
Yeah.
do I get involved with, like, how do I buy stealth startups products? How can I get involved with you guys?
Well, right now we're sort of finishing our first beta software, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
which is all web based, and it's really like a kind of an end to end system from writing a story that's interactive
Mm-hmm.
all the way to doing the usual tasks, whether it's for film or for animation, boarding, prevising, so on and so forth, all the way to publishing. And we try to hit this um, kind of a common theme for interactive media, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
And these names are all like, they're not necessarily the right ones because some of these like names have been given different meanings for so long.
Mm-hmm.
People think interactive film, they think, this is Bandersnatch on Netflix, or this is the old CD-ROM films and so on. And there's so much more variety. I mean, VR is basically an interactive medium.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we kind of figured out like how to make an interactive film, whether you want it to be like fully interactive where you affect the story, whether it's just something that you interact with but the story's there, whether you want agency or no agency, whether you want it this format or that format, whether it's a VR thing or an AR or a TV thing. There is a certain structure that helps make those kind of films and helps write them and think about them. And so we have tools that we've been working with like some writers and some small projects here and there to kind of just make sure that we have all the pieces together. But we're very close to releasing our first beta of the tool set. And we also ourselves, because we love it, we're making our own show that's interactive, as well as helping other small studios who have some ideas they want to work on and help them make their shows possible.
So let me ask, if you could go back
Mhm.
to Marrakesh and give yourself some advice,
Yes.
what would it be?
Um, I would say don't don't worry, because I remember being a kid in Marrakesh. The First of all, my parents, the height of their sort of, because I was also in a poor area of Marrakesh, and the height of my parents, dreams for me is I become a teacher, get a job, get married, so on and so forth. And I remember being a kid in high school and so on, hoping that someday I can make it to the big city, which was Casablanca at the time. I always wanted to get out of whatever I was. Um, and so it went, and maybe someday I'll live in Paris and it'll be cool, like in the movies. I used to watch the Oscars, of course, on TV, and I could never have imagined being at the Oscars, which happened with Pearl. I could never be, imagine being on stage at the Annie's Animation Awards and give a speech about, like how great it was. Like everything that happened to me is way beyond what I imagined. But I was all worried at that time about like what's gonna happen when I ever do anything interesting.
And that is Season 3, Episode 7 of the Producers Lounge podcast. Thank you to my guest Rachid El Guerrab for joining us. You can find out more about him by checking out the show notes and subscribing to our YouTube channel at Greater Grander. Our intro and outro music today was Kumasi Groove by Kevin MacLeod. Our episode still image is by Ricardo Tomas on greaterandgrander.com. We'd love to hear from you, and you can check out this week's accompanying article on greaterandgrander.com entitled 12 Game-Changing Ways Artists Can Ethically Use AI to Boost Their Creative Business. Link in the show notes. You can stay up to date by following us on YouTube and social media at the handle Greater Grander, all one word. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and wherever fine podcasts are found. And also, if you like what we do, share this podcast with a friend who you think will enjoy it. Join us next week for more cocktails and questions, and until then, keep producing dreams.